He thought coming home early would be nothing more than a quiet surprise for his family. But the moment he stepped through the door, his world shifted. In the corner of the room, his young son stood frozen, eyes wide, lips trembling, while the maid hovered over him, doing something that made his chest tighten in disbelief. What unfolded in that split second wasn't just a personal betrayal, it carried the weight of a prejudice he thought he had left behind. And when the truth came out, it would force him to face a reality far darker than he ever imagined. Daniel Foster had built his empire from nothing. Long nights, risky deals, and sacrifices most people would never understand. Now, in his mid-40s, he lived in a sprawling estate on the edge of the city with his wife, his 8-year-old son, and a small staff that kept the house running. The maid, Maria, had been with them for years. Quiet, efficient, and often overlooked. On most days, Daniel's schedule was packed with board meetings, investors' calls, and endless travel. Home was his sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. His son, Ethan, was his pride, bright, curious, and full of questions about everything. Daniel had hired the best tutors, the best nannies, the best everything to ensure Ethan had a childhood better than his own. But underneath the polished surface, small cracks had been forming, moments Daniel brushed aside. Offhand remarks from guests, the way some visitors barely acknowledged Maria, or the subtle shift in tone when her name came up. He'd noticed, but never thought much of it. That Friday, a sudden change in his travel plans gave him an unexpected gift, an entire afternoon at home. No calls. No meetings. Just time to surprise his family. But as he stepped through the front door, the quiet stillness felt wrong. Something was about to shatter that sanctuary forever. Daniel set his briefcase down quietly, the faint echo of its clasp snapping shut carrying farther than it should in the silence. The house felt paused. No distant hum of the vacuum, no clinking of dishes from the kitchen, no sound of Ethan's laughter. He moved down the hallway, each step feeling heavier, guided only by a faint, muffled noise from the living room. As he turned the corner, the sight made his chest tighten. Ethan stood stiff and small, his eyes darting toward Daniel for a split second before dropping to the floor. Maria stood beside him, holding a crumpled piece of paper in one hand and a small rag in the other. Her face was set, calm, but strained. Daniel almost spoke, but something in the air made him stop. It wasn't just the awkwardness, it was the weight. The way Ethan's shoulders hunched as if he'd done something wrong. The way Maria's hands trembled slightly. Then he saw it. The paper in her hand, an assignment Ethan had been working on, now smeared, edges damp. He caught glimpses of red ink across the page, corrections scrawled so harshly they cut into the paper fibers. The handwriting wasn't Maria's. "Who wrote this?" he asked, though his voice came out quieter than intended. Maria looked away. Ethan whispered, "At school." A knot formed in Daniel's gut. He took the page, scanning the crude remarks in the margins, mocking Ethan's handwriting, questioning his intelligence. And then, the last line, "This is what happens when people like you try to fit in." Daniel's jaw clenched. His son was 8. 8, and already carrying the weight of someone else's prejudice. Maria finally spoke, her voice low, almost apologetic. She'd been trying to explain to Ethan what it meant, why people said such things. She'd been wiping away his tears when Daniel walked in. The words from the paper replayed in Daniel's head, growing louder. Memories he'd buried, boardroom comments brushed off as jokes, the sideways glances at charity galas, rose to the surface. This wasn't just Ethan's pain, it was a cycle Daniel had hoped his wealth and status would shield his family from. He knelt beside his son, feeling the boy's small frame tremble under his hand. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. All he knew was this was no longer a problem he could ignore. Outside, a car horn blared, snapping him back. Maria shifted uncomfortably, as if debating whether to tell him the rest. "Daniel," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's more you need to see." Maria led Daniel into Ethan's room, her steps slow, as if each one carried a burden she'd been holding for too long. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small folder, papers neatly stacked, but worn at the edges from being handled over and over. Daniel opened it and froze. Inside were more school assignments, each marked with cruel, cutting remarks. Not smart enough. Stay where you belong. People like you will never succeed. Some were scrawled in red ink, others in pencil, but all carried the same venom. At the bottom of the pile was a drawing Ethan had made. It was supposed to be of his family, but Daniel noticed something chilling. Maria was missing. In her place was an empty outline with the words, "They said she doesn't belong here," written in shaky handwriting. His hands trembled. He had fought his entire life to escape the shadows of prejudice, to build a world where his son would never feel its sting. Yet here it was, seeping into the walls of his own home, poisoning the innocence he had tried to protect. Ethan stood in the doorway, small and silent, watching his father read every word. Daniel's throat tightened. This wasn't just about Ethan, it was about Maria, about every unspoken slight she'd endured under this roof and outside of it. The truth was laid bare. Wealth hadn't shielded them. Status hadn't erased the color of their skin or the assumptions people carried with it. A surge of anger and helplessness collided in his chest. He wanted to call the school, confront the parents, demand justice. But right now, all he could do was kneel, look his son in the eye, and promise that this would not be ignored. Because this wasn't just a wound. It was a battle line. In the days that followed, Daniel became a different man, not in wealth or stature, but in the weight he carried. He met with the school, demanded accountability, and refused to let polite silence protect those who had hurt his son. Policies were reviewed, apologies were made, but Daniel knew change was more than words on paper. At home, he spoke with Ethan, not just about the cruelty of others, but about his own journey, the walls he had to climb, the lies he refused to believe. Maria, once a quiet shadow in the background, became a voice in those conversations, sharing her own stories of being dismissed, overlooked, and judged for things she could never change. The house felt different now, not because the injustice had been erased, but because it was no longer hidden. And in that truth, there was a strange strength. Ethan began to draw again. This time, Maria stood beside him in every picture. But for Daniel, the incident was more than a family wound. It was a mirror held up to a world that still believed money could buy safety from prejudice. He knew now that no fortune could shield a child from the sharp edge of ignorance. Some nights, he'd stand in Ethan's doorway, watching his son sleep, and the same question would haunt him. How many more children have to carry this weight before we decide it's too heavy for any of them to bear? And for those who still think racism is a ghost from the past, Daniel had only one thing to say. It's here. It's real. And it's our responsibility to face it.